I'll give you the cue.
Okay.
Liz, I'm going to give you the cue later at work.
Tape is rolling, everybody. Quiet, please. Everyone. Okay.
All right. Welcome to our session today. We have a panel session for the HCE 510 Introduction to Rehab Counseling and Services class. And we're honored to have such a wonderful group, a diverse group of consumers as well as students. So I'm very excited to introduce our panel. And we'll be focusing today on the topic of inclusion, community supports, and also specifically wanting to talk a little bit about advocacy, or hopefully the panel will enlighten us a little bit about the need for self-advocacy and working with people with disabilities to support their own advocacy. And so I'll let the panel introduce themselves. We have panelists that are here for speaking from experience, and also for certain organizations, and I'll let them identify the organizations that they work for. And so we'll start on the left side of the panel, and Brad Strauss is here. Brad?
Yeah, I'm Brad Strauss. I work with Alpha One. Alpha One is the Center for Independent Living for People with Disabilities in Maine. We've been the CIL in Maine for about over 35 years now. I lost my vision about 20 years ago when I was 40 years old, so I've been on both sides of the road now, with both having experienced the disability, overcoming some of the obstacles, and then working with folks with disabilities to help them do the same. I don't know if you can see him, but I have my trusty companion here, Sam, on the floor. He's my leader dog. He won't be contributing too much, except ambiance.
All right. Thanks, Brad. Vicki.
I'm Vicki McCarty, and I work for the Consumer Counsel System of Maine, which is a group that was put into statute by the legislature. And it's a group that's made up of all consumers of mental health services. And we do a lot of public policy work and advocacy with the legislature on issues that are of most importance to folks with mental health issues, plus people who are differently abled in other ways as well. And I also have low vision. I have low vision, and usually I rely on seeing eye people as my guide sometimes, as an accommodation.
They're harder to train, though, than the dogs, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right, Brad. I have to agree.
All right. Christian.
Chris Carson. I'm a student here for the class. I'm a voc rehab counselor in Augusta, and I've been doing that for just a little over a year. I love it.
All right. And how long have you been working with people with disabilities?
Well, I'd say probably my whole life.
Yeah.
But now it's more one-on-one, more focused and concentrated.
Right. All right, Charlie Bernacchio. I'm the instructor of the course and coordinator for rehabilitation counseling at the University of Southern Maine. And I also have a disability. I've had polio, childhood polio, and also a head injury over the years. So I also bring that experience to the panel.
I'm Natalie St. Pierre. I'm here as not just a consumer, but primarily as a consumer today. I've had the privilege to work with Charlie and his classes over the past this is year 3 now.
Yeah.
And I have past experience working with Alpha One, voc rehab, as well as I formerly worked with Northern Maine Development Commission as a business outreach counselor. Sam's not happy with that.
Excuse me.
Sam has an opinion.
Business outreach counselor, in which I really got out into the community and encouraged businesses to really practice, ADA compliance and inclusion. I've gotten involved with this particular panel because I had the privilege of helping to organize an empowerment conference in northern Maine, where I was able to meet some former colleagues and get involved in that respect. So I'm happy to be here today.
I'm Liz Nitzel, and I'm a student in Dr. Charlie's class, and I'm also a vocational rehabilitation counselor. I work with Chris in Augusta, and I work with an adult caseload in the Waterville area, and I also have the opportunity to work with the High Hopes Clubhouse.
All right, thank you. It's wonderful. It's such an honor to have all of you here. And I think what we kind of wanted to do was to sort of start off by talking about some of the issues for people with disabilities, and as it pertains to inclusion, and also what sorts of difficulties or challenges do we still experience. It's been 25 years this year since the ADA, so we've been celebrating in a lot of places that this is historic to have 25 years, but yet at the same time it seems like there are certain issues that are pervasive that we still can't get past with public perceptions of people with disabilities, and we still have controversy over the kinds of impressions that the public has, that people are needy and dependent and have to be on entitlement all the time. And I'm wondering about that, and I'm wondering what sorts of impressions people have of where we are at this point.
I think being an individual who, I have cerebral palsy and I've had it since birth. It's not, I've kind of just dealt with it, or it is what it is, and it's never been an obstacle for me. But I think still one of the common misconceptions is that, well, how can people seem to be surprised that I'm really active in adaptive sports, that I have full-time employment, that I have a child, that I've been married. All these things that everyone else seems to experience is still kind of a eureka moment for people. They seem to be stunned by that revelation. I think that we've come a long way and made tremendous strides, but I think that in the day-to-day life, when you're mingling throughout the community, people are still stunned by the little things. And that seems to surprise me, because on a large scale, you do have more acceptance and tolerance and inclusion, I think, but it's the little day-to-day things that people tend to not expect so much, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Can I respond to
Sure.
what you're saying? I too have cerebral palsy.
Nice.
And isn't that wonderful? And it seems like there's few of us in the capacity that we serve in.
Right.
And I was born in the 50s, so I had probably a much different experience than you did, because we didn't have the ADA back in those days. I was fortunate in that I was a brilliant person, so my teachers really liked me, and so they always went to bat for me. But, I think what you need to do, and probably you experience this, is that you have to accept the fact of who you are and how you and your limitations. But you also have to say, what are my expectations for myself? And if you project those expectations outwardly, people can sort of look past
Sure.
any kind of thing that you have. In fact, I remember I was a seminary student at one time, and so they were talking about driving and something, and I don't drive because of my low vision. And people said, "Oh, you don't drive?" So I think in some ways, there are hidden disabilities that we have,
Sure.
although we're differently abled, and that's an interesting thing, to those folks that are, it's more obvious, the
Sure.
other kinds of abilities that people have.
I think for me as well, I would say I was kind of on the cusp of that, because I'm 35 today, actually, as a matter
Oh,
of
wonderful.
fact.
Congratulations.
And so, thank you. Being born in 1980, I can remember distinctly my mother talking in later years about how, I was first diagnosed at the age of 2.
Yes.
So at that time, there were a great deal of institutions for which individuals with disabilities were kind of placed in mass, if you will. You know, they were exploring conditions and really unsure as to where children should be. And I remember she had said that she had visited one of these places, and she was in there for a short time and turned around and walked out because she just didn't have a pleasant experience. And for me, I'm grateful that she made that decision, because my life could have been immensely different.
Yes.
I mean, I can't even fathom what my life may have been like had she opted to stay there. I've accomplished insurmountable things, but I wouldn't have had she stayed at that institution, I don't believe.
Now, you see, it's interesting you say that, because I was raised in the foster care system, and I was with one family for many years, all through my growing years, but I went back to my family of origin, because I said, so what was that all about? How, and they said, well, your mother, suffered from mental health challenges, and we had our own families, and it was difficult, so we had to send you away, and it's just so interesting, in being in the foster care system. I was more lucky than most, But one of the things that always struck me with teachers and people that were close to me was they would say, I was always told I could do anything I wanted.
Sure.
And I think that makes a difference. And I think that in spite of all the accommodations that we still, we're getting today, that, you've got to believe in yourself. And I think as counselors and people who assist other people, you have to maybe even think about putting yourself in somebody else's place.
Sure. Absolutely.
Well, I think, too, that I think we do have to help other people look beyond our disabilities. I think that we have come a long, long way. I've lost my vision. My experience was different than your guys, because I didn't lose my vision until I was 40 and didn't know anything, didn't know anybody with a disability up until that point. But and so things have improved since then, but they're still not all the way there. And it depends on what part of the country you're in and where you're at, too, in large part. But I think at the end of the day, it's up to every one of us individuals with a disability to be our own best advocates, and to have people to encourage them or even force them to look past our disabilities to who we really were. I had some very, very rude awakenings when after I lost my vision. Like I said, I was 40 years old. I had my own appraisal company. I was the city assessor, branch manager for a savings and loan, and I was cruising around pretty happy and pretty comfortable, pretty competent guy. I lost my vision, and when that became apparent with the cane, people started to treat me like I was 6 years old, like I was, they started to see just a blind guy, and not the person. Any other person beyond that, just who they thought a blind person was or who should be. That was a tough thing to learn how to manage, and I think I think you're right, Natalie, because we have to somehow develop our own confidence. Hopefully, you have the people in your lives that will help you do that, but a lot of people don't, and so what do? And even those of us who have the encouragement, we still got to get out there and do it. So I think learning who we are, developing that competence as real competence in the real world, real competence with our disabilities, by learning the techniques and learning the skills, and then through that gaining the confidence, and then portraying that, making people see our competencies and not our disabilities is so critical, and we have to do that, every one of us individually.
Certainly.
If I could just go back to Vicky's observation about the fact that there were expectations. People looked at her and said there were things that she could do, anything that she wanted to do, and I think that's kind of sort of an undercurrent of what happens when people perceive you as a person with a disability, and they are looking at you through the disability lens, as opposed to being a person who has capabilities. And I say that when Natalie mentioned that she was trying to reflect how she has different roles now. She's a mom, she's a partner, she's also an athlete, and when she wants to be recognized for those sorts of things, that's not what people see. People perseverate on the fact that she has a disability, and I wonder about that. If that's really what happens, is the expectations that people have are shaded because of what they see or want to see, and maybe that's part of the problem we have.
May I ask you? Oh,
Oops, I'm sorry,
no.
Vicki.
I was going to ask you because I'm curious, and I apologize for jumping in. But
Sure.
So, do you think that people see you first as a person with other with other able abilities?
I do now. Because I've made a point to, because I've accepted who I am and I'm completely confident in that. I think that exudes, and so you can't help but see me as a person versus person with a disability. You can't. It's like, because I'm essentially, for lack of a better word, I'm exuding it to the point of ad nauseum. I believe anyway. Because I think that when I was younger, perhaps you have those small pockets. I've always been really outgoing, and I've always been accepted for who I was as a person, which is great. It doesn't mean that it came without challenges, and it didn't come without people kind of questioning my ability to do things. But I think as I've gotten older and I've become my own self-advocate and really stood up for myself and the skills that I possess, you see all that first. But I still have the occasion where I get treated with kid gloves, because you come in with new individuals that don't know you, they've never met you, and they're still really compelled to help, or compelled to treat you with kid gloves, not because they mean you disrespect, but because they want to aid you, because they feel as though you might need that. I'm not offended by that, but I find it still.
Yeah, and I think too that more and more people do have that understanding and have the openness and have. And because of the ADA and more people with disabilities have been getting around in the public, it's become somewhat more normalized. It's not such an unfamiliar event or an unfamiliar experience with people. So I think there is all that. But despite all that, I don't think I could say across the board that everybody treats me, sees my confidence first and everything. You know what? Frankly, there's quite a few people that don't. And I think part of the adjustment process, at least for me, is recognizing that it's not going to be uncommon, despite who I am, and despite what level of competence I have and can project. There are some people, I'm just not going to break through their walls right away, and I just have to accept that and say, okay, fine, they are who they are, and they have their limitations as well as mine. I would argue which has the biggest disability, but
right. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, just because I exude that confidence doesn't necessarily mean that someone is going to take it and run with it the way that I hope that they will. But I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
it's not my problem.
Yep, perfect.
I think that's that difference there is.
Well said.
It's not my issue.
Yes.
And I a long time ago stopped trying to make it my issue. But I did do that for a long while. You try to.
Yep.
My disability at one point in time did come first. It was like, there's Natalie, the girl in the wheelchair. Okay, that was like my label. It was like my tag, if you will, but not so much anymore. My disability and my chair and or my loft strain walking canes, those are like really unique fashion accessories that I use to kind of tell my story. They're not who I am. It's a part of who I am.
And I think something that you just said too is if not the biggest thing that we can help assist people to achieve, it's right up there next to whatever it is, and that is that self-acceptance, and that whole thing is, I'm comfortable with my disability, I believe in my own competencies. If somebody else doesn't, that's not my problem. And I think as counselors, if we can devote a large part of our efforts to helping people achieve that, because I think there's a lot of people with disabilities, especially newly disabled people, who don't have that.
Sure.
And until you get to that point, I question how much progress you can really make in most other areas of life. That's the elemental place to get. And as counselors, we should be trained, we should have ways, we should put a lot of effort into helping people get to that point. Once they do, then helping into employment and every place else is going to be far more expedient, I think.
I think a part of that, I'll shut up in just a second, I promise.
You go right
I
ahead
think a
and
part
talk.
of that self-acceptance, though, speaking from a counselor perspective, talking with folks with disabilities who are not really at that point, if you can, one of the things that's helped me, being a person that can identify, as a counselor, being that person that can identify the strengths within that person and the attributes that they have that benefit society, and pointing them out, to those attributes out to them, is a tremendous tool.
Yeah.
Because then they start to see their marketability as an individual and not as a person with a disability.
And they're focusing on their own competencies where they should be.
Exactly.
You know, and I remember as an example of that, when I lost my vision, I knew I had to retool and get a different career, so I went back to college, had no idea really how I was going to handle that or if I could do that well. And I remember standing in the departmental office one day and then kind of thinking, geez, if I was a professor here, how would I get along doing this? You know, how could I do this job? And I'm thinking, gosh, you know, I'd have to have the secretary here find files for me because I'm not going to be able to find regular files and so forth. And as I'm thinking that, the head of the department, who was one of my own professors, he came out and he goes, hey, Joanna, you know, would you write this memo for me, blah, 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 blah. And she said, fine. And she went back in the office and it suddenly dawned on me, I would never, even blind, I would never ask that woman to do that for me.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I realized, so maybe I might have to have her go get my file, but I wouldn't ask her to do that.
To write
So
your
it's a
memo.
balance. You know,
Right.
he's got his incompetencies just like I have my incompetencies. And none are any bigger or worse than the other. And I started to get it then, you know. And I think we have to help others get that, just like what you're saying.
It doesn't come without struggle, though. Like, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
It does not come without days where you're just like, all of it, throwing it out the window. But it usually doesn't last very long, and you usually, you know, you're able to come back to the center and say, no, I am who I am, and that's totally cool, and I'm gonna rock, you know.
Yeah, this
the
ain't
world
going
by
away, so
storm.
I might as well get back to
Well,
it. Yeah.
you know, I mean, I think inevitably it is what it is, and you have to make the most of it. And that goes for a person that is more able-bodied or differently abled. Ultimately, you have one shot, so you get to make it what it is that you want it to be, and that has nothing really to do with ability, because that's across the board. So I think it's completely as you make it.
Yeah, well, every single person, no matter who they are or what kind of, it's up to you. Bottom line,
That's
it's
right.
up to you. You know, you got to know what's going to do it for you. So get to doing it
that's
and
it.
get back at it. And I think sometimes too we can give ourselves and others permission. You're going to have bad days, and that's okay. Expect that. You know. I remember asking one of my blindness mentors, you know, geez, when do you get over this? And he left. He says, well, forget that. You'll never get over it. He says, this sucks. Yeah. He says, it's better to not be blind. But he says, what will happen is that you'll get way, way, way better at managing it. It won't. The bad times won't come as often.
Perfect.
They won't be as intense, and they won't stay as long. Yeah. So it gets better, but it never goes away.
No.
And I thought I was relieved. Because then I thought, okay, well, I can stop trying to get over it then, and just get on with it instead, you know.
Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I'm thinking you answered a lot of my questions. I was going to ask Brad, as a counselor, what could I do to help facilitate somebody moving toward the next step of their journey in feeling more confident or feeling, and when you mentioned focusing on skills. And the interesting thing, and I'm not sure, Chris, if you're feeling it too, but everything that has been said, I have felt in my development. I have felt those times when you're so insecure that you don't know how to move forward and you just do it. And so it's interesting to hear that everybody, regardless of their situation, has had similar movements to get them forward. You know, whether, I mean, I assume that I'm considered able-bodied, but I have definitely felt at times not on top of my game, or at times like I was less able than the next person.
Sure.
And similar to you, Brad, I've often been proven wrong. I've often, I've often moved into something thinking, oh, I don't know if I can do that, and then you hear something and you think, oh, I guess I can do,
Right.
So it's interesting that we all have similar journeys.
I would do two things that I try to utilize through a lot of hard-won experience, and been pretty successful with this kind of a general approach with folks, trying to help folks along their own path. Is number one, either find out, as you guys were saying, find out what is an individual's competencies. And Charlie and I were talking about this. Somebody can have the exact same disability and everything else, but have far different competencies.
Mm-hmm.
So find out what those are, and then create some create some things for the person around those competencies where they can use those competencies and begin to demonstrate their own self-competency and understand and recognize that they do have competencies. That's one thing you can do. The other thing that I use a lot is, I know we're supposed to be vocationally oriented, but a lot of times, a vocational orientation, at first of all, somebody's adjusting, that's not even on their radar screen. That is not a goal for them. Mm-hmm. And so most of the things regarding a vocational goal is completely unmotivating for somebody. They're not going to have, so you're not going to make any progress. What I do instead is while we're talking, or sometimes instead of talking about vocational goals, I'll say, well, what did you do before your disability, right. or what do you wish you could get back to doing, or something like that, and find out what is that individual's real interest, what's their passion, and then once I find that out, then start to, especially in blindness, start to teach blindness skills, the blindness skills necessary for them to again get back to gardening or fishing
right.
or whatever they want to do. And once they find out that you can learn these new skills, apply them successfully, become competent in that, it starts kind of an avalanche. Sure. They realize, oh, geez, okay, I can do things. I can. And that confidence starts to come back because they start to recognize and understand that not only are they competent, but also you can still be competent even if it's in different ways. It's still competency. You can still arrive at the same place. So that those two things can be fruitful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. So some of the things that we've talked about so far are tied to how the person with a disability can be empowered in thinking of themselves and their capacity, and we've had each of you share some of the ways that you've been able to do that. If you think about the negative attitudes that people have, what do we know about being effective in terms of changing those attitudes? Has it been a question of just having more opportunities for people to be in the community and to be visible, people with disabilities, so they're not housed someplace, where nobody sees them or nobody has interactions, but they're out in the more contact? I mean, that's always been kind of the idea is with more social contact, people get normalized.
And we at Alpha One, we've talked about that, and I've given lots and lots of thought to that, and I'm sure you guys have too. And I think because of the ADA and the providing the opportunity for people with disabilities to get out in the community, I think that opens the door to familiarity and really begins it. I remember studying in a sociology class that the best way to break down myths and a consistently reliable way, maybe the only one, is actual contact with somebody so that the myths can't stand up to the reality. So that is absolutely the best way. But that's pretty slow. I would still like to see, I remember talking with a black guy back in the 60s, and some of you guys weren't around back then, but he had a good point. He said, how are we supposed to get integrated into the society? He said, how many times do you open up a magazine and see a black person? And I'm telling you what, back then you never did, ever. Or on a billboard, or in a movie, or a TV program, or a TV commercial. All of those mass media stuff that really form and inform our culture and shape our culture. We've got to become integrated into that as well in order to do it on a broad scale. And using the same question with a person with a disability, it's getting better, Didn't you love Breaking Bad? I thought that was great, you know, with that character with CP in there. Because you just liked the character. It didn't take long. You would look right past his, I'm sure that helped a lot of people. But not everybody watched Breaking Bad, you know. But I think that needs to become more and more common throughout in magazines and advertisements and movies and TV programs and more full. And I think when that starts to happen, I think the barriers will come down a lot more rapidly.
I think it's happening slowly, but it's happening. You've got, you know, TV shows are going more mainstream with inclusion. You've got the fashion industries being more inclusive. I can remember being, I'm dating myself now, 19, and I attended modeling school in Denver. And at the time, I not only by typical industry standards, I was considered a plus-size model, but I was also a plus-size model with a disability. And it was like, oh, am I really going to do this? How's this going to work out? But I remember taking part and everybody being completely open to that. And I think we're seeing it more and more slow and steady. And doors are opening. But again, you know, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I was going to say before you had brought it up, the only way that we're really going to get there, I think, is for it to become, I hate to say it, but for it to become trendy.
Yeah. And you have to show that with regular people too. That has to be. You can't point to Stephen Hawking and say because then the first thing you got to do when you get a disability is become Stephen Hawking.
Right.
You know, and so that's not going to work. It's got to be everyday kind of people too.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the difficulties is it's usually still those human interest stories is typical when somebody is being interviewed on TV. It's because, you know, they did some sort of incredible
super
feat,
trip, yeah,
and not really focusing on just, you know, or at least giving a sense that people with disabilities are.
That's not normalizing. You know,
are in the workforce and in schools and, you know, colleges and.
Well, I think we have a barrier that applies to a lot of people, not just those of us with certain disabilities, and that's transportation. You know, I mean, I've always been very clever at, you know, trading rides and stuff because I don't drive. In fact, when I first got my job, I was an outreach coordinator instead of a systems specialist, and I had to go all over the state. So how was I going to do that? Well, fortunately, I had some friends and family that didn't have much to do and wanted to help out, you know, and they could do other things while they carted me here and there and everywhere, as long as I was able to pay for their maintenance of their car and their gas. But that's still a huge barrier for people, and not just people, you know, with disabilities. And especially in Maine, because it's such a fragmented state.
Oh, yes.
I think that goes along too with the need for universal design everywhere. I recently took my mother to the mall, and my mother has been recently using a wheelchair. By the time we got done shopping, I was exhausted from trying to get up over curbs, and it's supposed to be accessible.
Yes.
Trying to get in doorways, trying to get in, and trying to get a wheelchair in a car that is not accessible.
Yes.
And I think that goes along with how expensive everything is too. And what kind of troubles me is like the basic architecture. When you think about building your home, you don't think, oh, I'd like to have a ramp. And I wonder now that I've had 3 people in my life who have been wheelchair users, why that is not our first thought is how do I make my home welcoming to everyone? Because I kind of think if you start with the bare basics of who am I and how do I want to approach my community, I would think that you start making your life accessible so that you can have friends in any condition.
That's a good thought.
And you got to get people motivated to do that. And that brings us back to what Charlie opened up with here too, and that was advocacy, and not just personal advocacy, but systemic advocacy too. And we do a lot of that, or try to, at Alpha One, and especially like with transportation, that's a huge problem. And you can get one thing you can do is try to teach people how to be creative and think out of the box like you learned how to do.
Yes.
To create their own ride networks, you know, and how to be patient and how to be assertive and how to advocate for that and put that together for themselves and how to spot the opportunities and develop opportunities for developing rides and ride.
It's about relationships.
Resources. It's about relationships. The other side of that, though, is systemic. You know, the kind of public transportation systems that we have right now just don't work. You know, especially in the rural areas.
Like Washington County.
Like Washington
like
County. There are
Pennsylvania.
systems available, though, like voucher systems that do work, but they don't rely on current infrastructure and so forth. So, quite frankly, the agencies and the systems that are in place now are not very friendly towards changing those kinds of things, you know. So the people in the disability community need to rally and need to reorganize and go to the public hearings for the 5-year transportation plans with the Department of Transportation. We struggle at Alpha One all the time trying to get people to those things, and we're not very successful with that. And we're not very successful at trying to figure out a way to get people interested, informed, and motivated to go do that, to help themselves and everybody else out. One of the things that people can do as counselors, and I'm not sure how appropriate this is in that role, but teach people, you know, make them aware how important that is and how effective it is. And at the end of the day, it's really the only effective way to change, for systems change. And then to encourage them to do that, you know, to learn how to do that, to actually do that, write letters, phone calls, emails. I think so many people, even in the mainstream, feel that, oh, what would my voice matter? You know, so that stuff is so far beyond that. All those people just do what they want to do anyway. Or different attitudes like that, and it is true when you don't watchdog them or you don't speak up, but you can matter. The people with the disability community used to be really organized. They got the ADA pass. You ever see films of that? Even when they were voting on that, you know, that hasn't happened since. And I think that. I get a little worried about that, and so these things don't change, and in fact, they kind of regress.
Well, and I think it goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because you've got a lot of people out there who, you know, and a large portion of the disability community don't have a lot of access to enough income.
But they didn't then either, and it was worse.
Well,
and it actually provided the motivation because it was worse.
but you know, I think it's harder to motivate yourself to do that when you're just trying to struggle these days. You know.
I think it becomes an issue of basic survival versus.
Yeah,
well, and I think that always, and I would have to disagree a little bit with that, because I think it was just as bad, or again, even worse then, because before the ADA, you know, people with disabilities certainly weren't more prosperous. I would argue they're probably a lot less prosperous. I think it's almost the opposite. I think because of some of the improvements that were made by the ADA, that people with disabilities have become too complacent. You know, still riding on the tide of that. But that tide, I'm afraid, might be receding, and they need to rally again.
Well, and if it becomes drastic enough, they probably will.
Well, and I just hate for it to get to that point again.
But I mean, it always seems to be that way, that it has to be.
But
I
think you're
crisis,
right.
You know,
I think you're right.
Put aside their differences, and you know, I know in my community, people, you know, we're still fighting among ourselves, which isn't good. You know, and that's why we don't get a lot done. You know, because we have, you know, our own ways of thinking how advocacy ought to be done. Some people do in-your-face advocacy. Some of us are negotiators. We like to work behind the scenes. I know our organization is, and some of you might want to join on this. We discovered, since we had to spend so much time at the legislature last session, that going between the Cross Building and the State House was a real hassle for some people, especially people, you know, who had difficulty walking.
It's not very accessible.
You know, and we spoke to Governor LePage about it at the empowerment forum that we just had.
Was that you?
That was me.
That was great. I thought I recognized your voice.
And yeah, and so he says he can do something about the Cross Building, but he can't do something about the State House because that's the legislature. But we're thinking of really, and we've got somebody to support it. We're thinking about putting in legislation, so that they're actually going to be mandated to do what they're supposed to be doing in the first place. To have things accessible for people, benches, and in hearing rooms we have problems with people that want to testify. And there's a barrier right there, Brad. People want to testify, but there's too many people in the hearing room, and there's not an accessible hearing room outside, and they're in the hallway, and there's no place to sit. So people become very discouraged.
And
I just want to hold things for just a second. We're going to take a short break, but this is, I think, a really important issue around whether or not our rights are being exercised, and how we get consumers to the point where they can actually, affirm those rights, the civil rights through the ADA and
Right.
and other laws. So, but just a couple minutes. Okay.
you got a commercial?
Yeah.
5.
Okay, welcome back, and we're here to return to our panel discussion tonight. And I also wanted to acknowledge that we have another panelist joining us. One of our students who is also in the class is going to be contributing to the panel, and Edith Dow is here from Folk Rehab.
Edith Dow. I'm an adult voc rehab counselor out of the Lewiston office, and I cover mostly the Wilton and Rumford areas.
Right. Thank you. And I did want to pick up where we were at the break, just talking about the need for advocacy, and as Brad was pointing out, the potential for the self-advocacy for consumers to have a voice, whether it is with the legislature or just the idea that we do have rights that may not be respected, and how to make sure that those rights are being honored.
Well, I think along with those rights, we have responsibilities. It's our responsibility to really find a way to make sure that people hear those rights and to honor those. I mean, I think that's part of our participatory thing that we need to do.
Yes. Well, you were talking earlier, Vicki, about the legislature, and so one of the things I think about the legislature, because I often hear this from people, is because of term limits now, we don't have any kind of institutional memory. And it's pretty amazing that even though we've had deinstitutionalization and it was, only a 20-year period, there are still a lot of legislators that don't know anything about that history.
Correct.
And we have to go and really educate them again, and bring these issues to light, and help them to understand
Especially when it comes to the consent decree.
Yeah, the consent decree is one good example. Yeah.
And
So when we know that our systems aren't working well, and we have to sort of develop these kinds of coalitions, it seems like the points that were made earlier, if we were well organized, that would really help. It certainly does help if you've got some resources to put into that kind of organized effort.
But you're talking about your students and people who are going to go on to do this kind of work. Well, those are the folks that we look at as allies. And so I think learning how to utilize and invite allies to come and join us is a big part of that.
Well, but also, too, I really, VR counselors are on the front lines. They're working every day with people with disabilities, with newly disabled people, and they're in an ideal position to begin to make people aware of these kinds of things. That's the VR counselors are a huge resource to help instill that knowledge, to even train, educate, encourage people to begin networking, to form peer groups is just so overused, I hate to even say it, but to form networking, to get in touch with others, to help the disability community to become united in some way again as a community, and for people with disabilities to understand the importance of that and to make the effort to do it. So I think the VR counselors are in an ideal situation again to raise that awareness, to provide some motivation, to provide some education for folks about how to do that and how important it is, and to encourage people that they can do it. Now again, politically, I don't know how appropriate that might be. Some of that might be for VR counselors, but I gotta believe that a lot of it they can.
Absolutely.
If part of going to work, part of being able to go to work is to show up consistently, and that involves good public transportation, and there isn't any good public transportation, then it seems to me that it would be very appropriate for VR counselors to help people with disabilities do something to improve that on a systemic level. So maybe that should be incorporated, as part and parcel of fundamental job of the VR folks. Things like that. They're a great resource. They're in a good position.
I would agree with that immensely. For all the things that I listed off in my laundry list of accomplishments earlier, driving is not one of them. And that is a huge issue for me, because I don't feel like it should be nearly as difficult as it is, or it has become. It's part of the reason that I moved from Aroostook County to now Waldo County, because it's a little bit better. I'm able to find some better resources, continuing to work with Alpha One and continuing to just really learn what's out there and available for me to try to obtain my driver's license and potentially drive. However, now that I've found the resources to make the technical piece happen, you still have the financial strain of making that happen. And I think it does go back to what Vicki was saying. I do believe wholeheartedly that things have not necessarily hit crisis mode to the point of we're all going to rally and make a difference. And so some of us have become complacent. But part of that is you have a split disability community, in that some folks are so fearful of even saying they have a disability that they could care less, systemically what's happening, because right now they're just living in a personal fear of, I can't let anybody know that I have anything wrong because it will jeopardize my entire little quality of life that exists already.
Yes. Yes.
I can't hide any part of my disability, really, but ultimately, that doesn't mean that I'm not fearful, because although I work full time, I'm very appreciative of that. I'm glad that I have that opportunity. It's a daily challenge, and I have to hope and pray that the company that I work for, as amazing as they are, uphold to what they've agreed to, and that's really being, understanding and flexible of my situation. It's a constant fear, constant fear that I have of, do I have all my ducks in a row so that if I have a bad day and I'm not working, it's not going to come back on me? So ultimately, it's a double-edged sword, really, because I do believe that it does stem from us, and we are going to have to, stand up and rally and make a huge change. But there's this level of complacency that's occurred out of both fear and just feeling as though we can't change the system as it is right now. So, it's a double. Vicki's thinking over there.
Well, what you're speaking to is that those of us in the mental health community and those of us who have, mental health issues, and I worked for years, as a sort of a direct service provider, and I wanted to take something known as a RAP program, which is a wellness and recovery program. And, my boss said, "But you're not mentally ill." And I said, "Well, no, because, you just didn't come out and tell people that, and you do. It's like you say, you struggle. What if you want to take a mental health day, and you shouldn't have to explain to everybody why that is. And
but you feel that you have to somehow or another.
Yes,
you have to explain it away.
Yeah.
I think in part I kind of hide behind the guise of my physical disability.
Ah.
Occasionally, because being an individual with a disability can be mentally wearing. Like it or not, confident or not,
Absolutely.
it can be mentally wearing and exhausting.
Can
because-
be. Yeah,
It is.
Yeah.
Right. So you have those days, in an essence, that are strictly, I need this mental health day.
Mm-hmm.
But I find myself saying, I'm having a minor health issue,
Mm-hmm.
instead of, I'm not good today.
I
Not,
don't think that's
not good
incorrect.
today.
Yeah.
You know,
I have to agree, yeah.
So I think that there's just some fear, and I also think for as good as the resources are, and as even statewide, I think we really, really work hard, but we have some tremendous gaps. Transportation being the biggest one.
And don't you feel sometimes that you have to really like, sort of almost overachieve?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
In order,
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
and that takes a lot of toll on you.
Because you're sitting next to whomever, and they may not necessarily be doing their job to par.
Exactly.
But you have to do it twice as hard and twice as
Exactly.
quick, because you're under a different microscope. Like, and it may not be true, but it is my perception that
Yeah.
I'm under a different microscope than my counterpart next to me, because most people in my situation don't work a 40-hour-a-week job.
That's true.
They would like to in some cases. But the opportunity is few and far between, particularly if you're in a more rural county.
Absolutely.
That was another reason.
Absolutely.
That was another reason that I moved. I was a small business owner, but I still wasn't making. I was doing mostly volunteer work, and I had a tremendous network that I had built over the course of 10 years, but it wasn't helping me make ends meet.
Let me ask you how that made you feel, though, when you had to move. I mean, wouldn't it have been better on some, if you could have stayed where you were?
I think in some ways yes, in some ways no. I think that where I was fantastic for where I was at that point in my life, but ultimately I was striving for a higher quality of life.
So you were growing.
I was growing as a person. I think, but I didn't feel like I could obtain the higher quality of life staying there.
Yes.
Had there been other opportunity, perhaps that would not have been the case.
I sort of did that when I lived in Washington County. I kind of shut down for 10 years.
But you do. I mean, I think I did for a couple of years straight, where I'm like, I'm going through the motions of all of my stuff, and I'm making great, community strides, and I'm advocating, and I'm speaking on panels, and I'm meeting amazing colleagues, and we're empowering people. All the while, I'm going home and saying, somebody please, somebody out there's got to help me pick myself up, because I don't know that I can continue to do it myself.
Well, you can get compassion fatigue, too.
So
We don't talk
yeah,
much. We don't
sure.
talk a lot about that.
I would agree. I want to hear from Edith, though.
Hear what from me?
I want to hear anything from you.
Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking a little bit about what Brad was saying about voc rehab counselors and the advocacy part about the transportation, and I think it's a little bit difficult for me. I started as an employment specialist covering all of Aroostook County, which was
that's a big county.
challenging.
Huge county.
And then I switched over to be a case manager for adults with mental illness, and I think I was a better case manager because I started as an employment specialist, and really starting out with the strengths-based stuff, and finding out what people can do, and then we'll deal with what you can't do later. But
Right.
sorry, Sam. We'll focus on what you can do and build upon that. But then going back to being an employment specialist, and now I'm here with voc rehab, and I get told a lot I'm too compassionate.
And you're not a box thinker. I know this about you.
Well, I like to think about it that I don't like to think outside of the box, Vicki, because I don't even want a box. I don't want any type of confinement at all. So let's just get rid
Good
of the
for
box
you.
altogether.
Because you just want to make it happen. Like,
Yeah,
that's it. Like,
yeah,
you wanna make
absolutely.
it happen.
And I'll figure out a way somehow, and I won't stop until I do. But I get told a lot that, Edith, you need to take your case manager hat off in my role now. So that gets very frustrating for me.
Absolutely.
And especially for the folks that have a case manager, and maybe the case manager's not doing something about it.
Yeah.
So I go back and forth about some of these things, especially when it has to do with transportation. If I have a client who's living in Livermore Falls and there's no, or some place past that, and there's no transportation for this person, but the person really, really wants to work. Well, when they come to Voc Rehab, they're supposed to be work ready. Or when they go to the CRP, they're supposed to be work ready, and that's what I mean. I'm sorry. When they get to the community resource person, they're supposed to be ready to go to work, and if that's the one piece that's keeping them from working,
And that happens
to
a lot.
me, that shouldn't be the piece that's preventing them.
Yeah, Brad was mentioning earlier, so I mean, even now you're bringing up a case where the instance when the work is there, but there's also another part of this person that has to be addressed or helping the person, and I think that's what often is a challenge for Voc Rehab counselors. Is we're training you to be holistic and to think about that other facet of the life of the individual, but you're supposed to just stick
The
with
system doesn't let
work.
you.
Yeah.
No.
I don't like to be put in a box.
No, nobody should be put
I've
in a
kind
box.
of found a different opportunity, but I'm also in central Maine. So even though the transportation is still very, very poor, I think I'm more supported in figuring out, okay, let's get the job. Let's get the job. We're going to figure out transportation later. And if that means, for instance, I'm working with a woman who does not drive, and she just got a job. So we went on the Go Maine site, and we're seeing who drives close to where you're going, and we're looking at that as a possibility. We're also looking at the Kennebec Explorer, can you arrive at 8:05 and leave at 5:05? Can you, what can you do? Can you access the Kennebec Explorer?
Can you do Airways? Can you,
In
yeah.
this situation, once VR stopped, if we did not have something in place, it would cost her $28 a day to get to work and back. Because she'd have to take a taxi to a bus, and then the bus to work, and then the bus back to the bus station, and then a taxi back home.
And excuse me, but it's not just the expense either. How long did that take?
Oh,
Everybody else for an
yes.
8-hour day, they can drive to work in 20 minutes, and it takes you 3 hours each way. That's not
Exactly.
tolerable.
It's
A
not-
person
it's not
can't sustain
acceptable.
that.
Right, and we're looking at $160 sometimes to take a
Right.
cab. I mean,
Right.
And
that's
that's
unreasonable.
inevitably
exactly.
that's inevitably where I'm at right now. Luckily, I have my partner who's in the back of the room and didn't want to be on camera, who we work together, so we're able to carpool. But let me tell you, if we didn't work together, it's $40 a day
Right.
just to and from work, not including getting back and forth to the store, not including the fact that if I calculate how long the cab could take, I'm looking at adding another 2 to 3 hours on my day. That's already a 10 to 12 hour day as it is. It's absolutely just not possible to do. I've gotten really lucky by being able to move and have better opportunity where I'm at right now. But that was also the issue in Aroostook.
Yeah.
I wasn't able to find really sustainable employment opportunities because you have to travel, just as Vicki was pointing out. And I am immensely resourceful, just like Vicki, but there are limits to that. It's like, how much can I physically essentially dole out? What can I do financially that's going to support my bartering system?
Exactly.
Because it is. It's ultimately
bartering system.
you're helping with fuel costs. You're helping with car maintenance. You might be doing a meal exchange.
Right.
There's a lot of financial costs associated with that barter system.
It's a kind of, and a lot of in-kind leverage.
Yeah, oh yes, definitely. So I think that it's really, really challenging, and I think the agencies do a lot. They do what they can, but they're limited. That box is there, like it or not. We don't like it. None of it. I guarantee none of us here like that box. It's there.
And I think a hard thing for people to understand is how that contributes to the other aspects of your life, your lives, our lives. When you've got all of the extra baggage with having to try to coordinate that and hold on to your job, plus have quality of life outside of the work.
I wouldn't last 2 minutes at McDonald's. I'll tell you
Oh
that
no,
right now.
Oh, me neither.
They'd
No.
throw me out.
Mm-mm.
You know.
Without a doubt.
And so it's about, and that's why, I support Employment First. Probably people here know about the Employment First initiative. I'm sure you do, Brad.
Yep.
And in the sense that, and also, it should be person first. You know, people should be, you know, their skills should be assessed, and a great deal of time and effort should be taken to place people where, you know, they're most happiest, and you know, and not just that you got to get some old job. I hate to say that, but you know, we have unique skills, most of us, you know, and that should be honored.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's something that regardless of what job I've been in, I had a great mentor from day one, and you know, she's taught me that everybody can do something as long as it's the right job with the right supports in place.
And
I believe
that should be one of our civil rights right there.
Absolutely.
Everybody feels much better, I believe, when they're needed,
Yeah.
and they're useful, you know, they feel useful, and they can give and receive. You know?
And I think a lot of, I mean, I've had this argument with, or sorry, disagreement.
Conversation.
Yeah, heated possible conversations with coworkers, you know, that, oh, well, you know, so-and-so can't work yet because they're not stable on their medication.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
okay, well, maybe if they had a schedule and they felt some self-worth and, you know, et cetera, then, and because they had a job to go to,
Has
then
some
maybe they would
incentives,
feel
yeah.
better. Or,
Sure.
you know, so-and-so needs housing first, so, you know, they can't work yet. Well, maybe if they had a job and they had some income
They might
to
get a
put towards
house.
housing,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
they would, you know, I
The whole chicken egg thing.
Yeah, it becomes a
I find
vicious
it,
cycle.
I guess I would find it very upsetting if anyone told my client that they were not ready to work. I want to hear from my client. If my client is ready to work, just like if I'm ready to work, it doesn't matter what else is going on in your life. If the client says, I want a job, then I'm not going to worry about what they do or don't have. We're gonna go for, because I'm their advocate. I'm working to make sure that they're getting what they want and what they know is going to stabilize them.
And
Have
what's
you
going to
seen
be
it-
successful too, what about this idea? I'm just going to throw a little bit of a wrench in the machinery here because I'm a little concerned about this too. As a person with a disability, you know, I'm trying to get jobs as a person with a disability. It's not easy, you know. Employers are across the board, you know, quite commonly, largely reluctant to hire somebody to, you know, they don't want to bother. You know, there's lots of people that don't have disabilities, and that's just way easier, and, you know, they're afraid of it, they don't understand it. So it's all, there's a lot of resistance out there. We all know that, both as counselors and as folks with disabilities. So if you convince an employer to hire somebody with a disability, and then that person with a disability really isn't ready, and they're not successful, what does that do for the confidence or the reputation of people with to hire a person with a disability again?
Exactly.
You know, so I think again, and I hear what you're saying, but I think we have to be real careful to not erode or you know, to make sure that when we put people with disabilities into a job position, that there's a good chance that they're going to be very successful, so that we, you know, start to gain on that kind of reputation and confidence from the private sector.
Or
you know.
they have some supports that will you know, that they
Something.
can use
Yeah.
to move in
Yeah.
that direction.
Brad, I think to answer your question, the word "put" that doesn't happen a lot in the office that I work in. We're not putting anyone anywhere. We are working as a team, so it's more of a team. And if somebody is not truly ready because of the adverse, I can't talk
It's okay.
today.
It's all right.
If they're not ready, it's going to come out in the things that they're doing, you know, as the steps you're taking to gain employment. Many people are going to decide, you know, as they develop their resume, as they develop this tool, as they develop, some people need to take a class to get ready if somebody wants to be a receptionist but they don't have any office skills yet. A lot of times during that process, if they're not ready, they're going to decide that they're not ready. So it's not so much putting somebody somewhere, but my clients and I work very closely as a team, and our CRP, which is our job coach or job developer, we're in touch constantly. It's a team. If there's a case manager, we're including that person, and we're really working to make sure that this is successful. And then I have the added benefit of working with the clubhouse, where if somebody, are you familiar with transitional employment?
Yep.
With that, the person is so supported that they can decide if it's not a good fit, they can end it. But for the most part, it's a successful experience. So it's been really well done.
And like with the transportation piece, it's such a which comes first, the chicken or the egg thing. You know, you can in those areas where transportation is so scarce, and somebody can be successful at their. You know, we have to approach these things comprehensively. You can't do it a piece at a time. It doesn't exist in reality in silos. So you get somebody, you help somebody get a job that they're good at, and put in some transportation at least for a while, but if it's not going to be sustainable, and it happens so much, then the person has a hard time showing up on time for work because they can't sustain that 4-hour transportation every day. And you know what, I don't know, like the KV CAFs, you know, the transportation, they are not the most reliable transportation system in the world, right? We know that in reality.
Friend.
In reality, you know, so, and so it's difficult, you know. How do you wrestle with that, especially as a VR counselor? It's so difficult with the way things are now to really put all the pieces in place and be confident that they're going to stay in place and that they're going to work.
So one thing, Brad, that I often think about now that you've mentioned the concern for making the job experience work and be a success, and we're all really devoted to try to figure out how do we build those in the transportation and supports and things. At the same time, it puts so much weight on the person with a disability. I think a lot of times, you know, that somehow if it doesn't work out, then they're responsible for it, or also, you know, they've got to stick with that job that they get, and that's very different than what most people without disabilities think about, because they get a job and then they say, well, if it doesn't work out, I'm leaving it, you know, and I'll get another job, and they don't worry about the fact, or in most cases, you know, that somehow they're responsible for that not being successful. But I think people with disabilities sort of, you know, own that. They often are, you know, it's sort of imposed.
I think that's why companies that do take that, I'm going to call it a risk, corporations that are willing to take that risk, organizations that are willing to make that leap, ultimately, you know, lucky for them, find a high number of retention for when they hire those folks with disabilities, because exactly what you spoke of. I have to say, you know, do I absolutely love the job that I do? No. Do I love where I work? Yes, but I don't love what I do. I'm a customer service center analyst. I'm on the phone 8+ hours a day, call after call after call after call. I work for a tech company, or a tech-oriented company. Fantastic company. Absolutely love the company. Cannot stand what I do, because prior to going into that line of work for the 40-hour-a-week opportunity, I was an entrepreneur. I worked in public relations. I did a bunch of outreach and empowerment conferences and all this type of work, a lot more advocacy. I don't do that now. Why? Because I punch a clock for 40 hours a week. The trade-off is, though, I have health benefits if I want them. I can go to the dentist. I can get my glasses, and I can have money in my savings account. So I think at some point it is exactly what you said. You know, we weigh it out. We don't anticipate getting to make that career change. We hope, we work and strive towards career advancement, but we're really not looking to leave that company. When they ask us at the end of the year if we're going to be here in 5 years, you bet your butt we are, because it took us forever to get in the door. And I think that that's a lot of folks with disabilities are immensely discouraged because even if they can find someone to point out those skills and those attributes that make them a unique individual and a marketable individual, once they find that opportunity, they're stressed out constantly because can they retain it, you know?
Yeah, and like Charlie says, you know, back in when I was sighted and in my younger years, I did exactly. You know, that's a great freedom. You know, I was fully able-bodied. If I didn't like a job, I could just quit, and I could look in a newspaper and pretty much do, if it was dig ditches, I'd go do that for a while, you know, or be a surveyor's helper, or, you know, there's all kinds of stuff. I had no limitations. Now I do. I got a lot of limitations. You know, I can't, even those transitional jobs aren't readily available for me. So I hate to say it, you know, I happen to have gotten lucky and worked for a great organization, and I couldn't have a better job, you know. Now, that wasn't always the case. But if I didn't have this job, you know, I think about, well, where would I go? And my options are far more limited than what they used to be. And it is kind of uncomfortable, at least, you know.
And I think on that note too, I like to point this out. I'm very, very grateful, and I do see myself advancing as in the future, career-wise. But I do feel, and I know that my colleague Avery feels the same because we've had this conversation. He's immensely overeducated and way underpaid, because there wasn't much else for us to do. Let's get a degree in this and that, and because we could get our education, but we couldn't apply it anywhere because there's not a lot of folks willing to take that risk or create that opportunity. And we ultimately have to, I don't know how many positions I've been in where I've made that position myself.
Yeah.
I've walked in and said, you have a problem with this, I'll fix it. And which is why most of it's been voluntary, because they can't put me on the payroll for something that I've ultimately invented. And some of them have in part, you know, 10 hours a week care, 20 hours a week care, because they realize that there's a need, but they can't support it full time. And I was doing a ton of that. And it was fantastic, but it wasn't enough to sustain me. I think before I went to work full time, I think for 2 years straight, I survived on $8,000 a year or less. I mean, that's not survival.
Been there, done that.
You know, it's not.
You should become wealthy just teaching people how to do that.
Right?
You know?
But I don't. But I'd love to say, yeah, right? I would love to tell you that I did it well. But do you know what came out of that? Aside from student loans, an immense amount of personal debt that I've recently finally paid off. I've finally been able to get rid of that. But that's what comes out of that situation. But that's not unique. I want to point out that that's not unique to me as an individual with a disability. That is just the way that sometimes works.
It is sounding a little bit like the American way.
It really,
I was just going to say,
really is. It is not unique to me.
Yeah. And I've got to say that I have always had financial insecurity in the sense that I have always felt like if I had a good job, it was sacred.
Yep.
Yeah. And now, you know, and I'm trying to think where it's not disability based that I would be afraid of losing it. But I think that it could be when I was young, our business went under, and we went from being very well off to food stamp level. And so I think that could be my disability in my mind. But so I can relate to a lot of what we talk about, and I also see it with a lot of clients. I haven't always worked with job seekers who had disabilities. I've worked with employment and training forever. And I haven't seen a lot of opportunity for people who have financial obligations to job hop.
Sure.
For people who don't have obligations, yes, you know, go do this and go do that. But for people who finally find the benefits, and that is sacred. And I've also owned a daycare where parents would send sick children because they did not have sick time.
Right.
So these are universal concerns.
Yep.
They may be even more challenging. I'm sure they're more challenging with a disability.
And
But-
that's just it. I'll bet if you could do a survey, you'd find out that far more people are trapped in jobs that they don't like.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they
Oh,
can't, I
yeah.
mean, you hear
Yeah.
it, there's movies, I mean, I think that's the American way. Not the American dream, but the American way.
Well, and-
But it is far harder and fewer choices if you've got the burden of the, of the unique obstacles a disability can create.
Well, and even, oh, sorry, Charlie, Dr. Hurley. Even the disability piece, like how many people walking around out there, they've never been to a doctor. So they don't have that nice little label that tells them, oh, you have X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
Or had they been to a different doctor, they may have a different sticker on their forehead. The kind that you can't, the disability that you can't see.
Sure.
Anyway, I'm sorry, but and that part frustrates me as well. And I've had that nice conversation too with some folks, because my thing that I'm working with a person. I am working with a person. And it's not that I don't care, because I care about the person, but I'm trying to help overcome the barrier to the problem. And if the person has a interpersonal problem with interpersonal issues, or the person can't get to work on time, or if the person whatever the problem is, that's what I'm trying to help them with.
Right.
So whether that is as a result of whatever the nice little sticker that they wear on their forehead is,
Or not. Maybe
yeah.
they're just, maybe
It
that's just
doesn't
their
matter.
nature.
You
Maybe
know,
that's just their nature.
I don't care what the label is, and so I'm a little bit different, than some. I'm not going to say all, because some people feel that way too. But I've had coworkers get upset with me. So to me, the disability piece is for the person that's billing the insurance. Or possibly the person, I used to say for the doctor who's prescribing the medication, or the person billing the insurance. I leave the medication piece out now because they're cross-using so many medications. I leave that one out.
Well, that's great to hear. That's great to hear that you really are attentive to the person, because that's a lot of what we're struggling with is, how disability defines what people see or understand, and that continues to be a problem. The thing I wanted to also point out, we're going to slowly be wrapping up, but I thought that some of the points that both Natalie and Brad were bringing up highlight the difficulty, and even Liz touched on this, of if there's a risk there, and if you don't hold on to those employment opportunities, or you can't take advantage of them, and then once you get employed, hold on to it. Most people with disabilities know what's there if they don't, and that I think is scary enough for them to know that if they're back on entitlements and what that life is going to be like, because once you've been there, you don't want to go back. I
Or
think
if you can get
heal.
those entitlements, they're a lot harder to get.
They're harder to get, but even when you do get on them, people think that it's a great deal, and it isn't most of the time.
I don't know anybody who thinks it's a
Poverty.
great deal. I don't know where you're getting people who think it's a great
Well,
deal.
the people who don't know the
yeah,
system, that's what it is. It's
Yeah.
most of the public thinks.
Well, yes, that's true. Somebody at the Empowerment Forum said something that really turned my head around, and that was, they said, society disables us. And that's a lot to think about, because, it might be true.
To a certain
It is.
degree.
And I just wanted to comment on something you said too, and Charlie and I had talked about this right on the way up here, actually. And with independent living, we're kind of the antithesis of the medical model. And we're always telling people, and I think it's absolutely true, it's what you just said, a disease or a medical condition is not a disability.
Yeah.
And I hate it when they're interchanged like that. What's your disability? CP.
Yes.
CP is not a disability, it's a
No.
disease. It's a medical condition. The impact that may or may not have on you, and there's a lot of different kinds of impacts, that might be disabling, but a disability is all about function, it has nothing to do with medical.
I wish doctors couldn't even
good
write
point.
letters saying this person is unable to work. No, I mean, maybe you can't sit for a certain amount of time, or you can't look at a screen. But then, oh, the person is sitting at home on their computer on Facebook all day. Like, you know, doctors should not be able to write those letters. It's
Yeah, but still, even when they do it sometimes, because there are businesses and places that cannot or will not accommodate such things, you know, because if you can only work a couple hours a day, how many employers are going to really want to have somebody who can only work a couple hours a day?
there's something that can be done.
But
There's
that's what
something
we
out
have
there
to
that-
work. But that's what we have to work on.
Exactly. Of course we do.
Finding people that are willing to step out of that and say, okay, well, what can we do, and how, and it really, I mean, aside from the advocacy piece, falls to this broad spectrum of engagement in opening the lines of communication like we're doing right now, because
Yes.
it is not about, I don't believe it's about a lack of willingness, I believe it's about a lack of knowledge. Because if you are not affected in some way, I would say almost daily, you don't think about it, and that's no fault of anyone's. I just don't think it's at the forefront of people's minds.
Right.
But going back to what Brad said, it's systemic, so there needs to be a real paradigm shift.
Sure.
We have to change how culture views it, you know, as a whole. You know, I think in order to really make it possible.
Yep.
I agree.
On that note, it's a good way to end the panel. You've all made some excellent points, and thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Brad Strauss, Vicki McCarty, Edith Dow, and Natalie St. Pierre, and Liz Nitzel,
Thank you.
and Christian, who stepped out for a little bit, but
Thank you.
And Sam.
and
And
Sam.
Sam.
Yes,
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.